Welcome to Beginners Fab. My name is Eric, and today we're going to be making a handrail. Over the past few days, I've been talking online about my project that I have with the handrail. I've mentioned it on Twitter and on Facebook a little bit. And today we're actually going to start on the beginning portion of that project. I designed a very simple form of a handrail because in the end they're going to put wood on top of the handrail, and the metal work only has to be done in a way that is strong and decent looking, but it's not like pristine finish work in this case. So what I'm going to do today is actually just tack up all of the structure for him so that he can see how it'll sit and give him an idea to make sure that that's what he wants before we proceed with the other stuff. First off, I have to go over the information that I have designed up in the computer. Also, I have to get everything laid out on the table, and I have to make the cuts that I have. For instance, where we were going to put the handrail going up the steps, I measured out the height difference between the upper plane and the starting plane or the lower plane. And then I also knew the distance between the handrail uprights, and I knew the total length of the handrail. So what I did was I actually designed it to scale in Illustrator, and then I put the spine of the handrail, the flat bar that I'm going to weld to the top of the two vertical tubes, drawn on there, and then I measured down from the top point of the tube toward the flat bar, and I know that's how much I need to cut off in a wedge from each tube to make it the angle that I need. While the handrail will be the same height off the top plane as it will off the lower plane, the difference is the methods of mounting the handrail to the two different planes are different. The upper plane is dirt and ground, so I actually have to have more tube on the upper portion, the upper upright, so that when it goes into the ground we can put cement around it and hold it into place, whereas the lower vertical mount will be welded to a plate that will be cement anchored into the ground so that it actually sits right on top of the cement pad that they have on their port. One of the things that I'm doing is I'm building it a little bit stronger than normal, just because through the conversation we know that it's going to be used a lot to actually support yourself on. And so I want to make sure that it'll withstand, you know, the time, the years of movement with actual supporting yourself on it, going up it basically every time somebody walks past it. I went with a 3mm wall 2x2 metal tubing, which is just over an 1/8 inch thick. And then I also went with a 6mm, which is just under 1/4, that'll go down the spine. And then the wood will actually have a recession routed out of it in the center that sits over that spine, and then it'll be bolted to the metal spine from the bottom up to make sure that the handrail is stiff. When we're working on these pieces, to make sure we get nice appropriate edges created and worked out on it, we need to make sure that we take a file and we file off all these little burrs here, just so it doesn't kick our square around, it doesn't make it lean in a weird angle and then mess up our line for cutting. Because since I'm cutting with an angle grinder, it's already going to be difficult to make a absolutely straight line, and if I don't have a good line to start with, it's going to be even more difficult.
So here you see that I'm actually using the square on the end of the tube, and because of that reason, that's why we took off the burr with the file earlier, to make sure that when I was putting the square up on the edge, it would mark correctly and be straight. And here I'm marking down about 1 centimeter from the top, and I'll mark it on this side, and then I'll mark it on the other side of the tube, which is at the lowest point, so that I can draw a straight line between the two of them, and then from that point I'll draw an angle using the square straight edge up toward the high point on the tube so that I get the angle that I need in a line, and then I can go back and cut it. Here I've measured from the end of the tube before I cut that wedge off, and I measured down 95 centimeters because I knew that was the height that I needed. And then I will actually go back and draw a straight line using the square all the way around the tube, because my 4-inch angle grinder isn't long enough or big enough to cut all the way through the tube in one cut. So I draw a square on each side of the tube, and you have to be careful with the radius corners on the tubing to make sure that your lines actually meet up. And then once I'm done with this line, I'll go back and I'll cut off the little wedge at the top, and also cut this tube in the center to give me the lengths that I need for the verticals. I'm getting ready to cut the tube now with the angle grinder, and one thing that's really important is to remember where you marked your line, especially if you're using like a marker or something that marks kind of thick. Did you mark it on center, just to the bottom, or just the top, or just the outside, or just the inside, so that when you cut, you don't cut it too short or you don't cut it too long. Here I've started to cut the wedge off the end of the tube so that I can have the angle I need for the spine of the handrail. And as you can see, I'm using the angle grinder. I'm also using a 1.5 millimeter cutting disc, especially for 3 millimeter and thicker. It cuts really fast. It does heat, so you have to be careful, because as the blade heats up, it'll start to get softer and it can have a tendency to warp. So while you're cutting, you not only need to make sure you're cutting a straight line on the line drawn, but also that the angle of the angle grinder isn't tilted to the left or to the right, because that can adjust or affect your overall cut on the thickness of the material, and it can make your angle from the top to the bottom more or less correct. Once this is all cut off, then I'll go back and start to trim it down and sand it down to make sure that the two sides that are angled are equal. And you can do this with the angle grinder. In this case, I'm trimming off with the cutoff wheel just to try to get it as close as possible. You have to use your eye a little bit on this. It's more kind of like sculpting. Here you see me using a piece of flat stock to just kind of get an idea of whether the flat stock rocks or not on the angles. And if it rocks, that means one wall is less or more of an angle than the other, and I have to adjust for that. Now I'm set up for cutting the center of the tube, and I just cut it each wall all the way around, making sure I stayed in alignment and making sure that my cut from one edge to the other met up with the cuts I had already made on all the other sides, to make sure that it was as square as possible when I cut it off. That's very important, especially on this piece, because as I do this piece, I will be welding it at the bottom to a piece of 1/4 inch plate, so it needs to be as smooth and straight as possible, square as possible, so that when I weld it to the plate, the vertical post doesn't lean to the left or to the right. Here you can see that I have a square drawn out on the piece of 1/4 inch flat plate, and then I have another square on the inside of that square. And what I've done here is, without getting it super exact, I decided that since the vertical post was 2 inches by 2 inches, or stated to be 2 inches by 2 inches, and you can tell that it's just under, which is typical, I made the bottom plate 5 inches by 5 inches, giving me an 1.5 inch border around the center pole on all sides. Now I'm just doing a test fit to make sure it fits flush and it fits square, and that all the measurements can be accomplished to the degree necessary. So I'm using the square here with the ruler on it to make sure that it fits, and I'm going to bump it around to make sure that when I get it to 1.5 on this side, it'll be 1.5 on all the other sides as well. Then I'll go back and tack it up. After I had test fitted the plate and found that the square did actually fit the way that I needed it to, I went ahead and cut the base plate out of the plate stock. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that I had in mind what side of the line I needed to cut to make sure that it was 5 inches by 5 inches. So that's something you need to keep in mind as well. You need to remember to draw your line and remember whether you need to cut on the inside, the outside, or on the center of the line you've drawn. Now, with the square in the center that I drew to mark where the vertical post goes, what I did was that I made sure I marked on the outside of the 2x2 square, so that when I put the post in the vertical position, it would allow me to see the square and how far in or out I was, so that I wouldn't be covering the line with the vertical tube that I was placing there and making it difficult for me to see if I was close to square in the center or not. Don't forget to always measure before you start tacking up, and make sure you have it as close to perfect as possible, because once you've made a tack and you try to cut it off or grind it off and then square up, it's possible, but it makes it much more difficult, because you either have to grind all that weld slag and all the weld off so that you can move it around easily, or you have to fight against it all, and it's just not that simple. Also, what you see that I've done here is I've made a extended ground, I guess you could say. I used the 1/4 inch plate that I cut the base plate out of for the handrails, and I attached the ground clamp to that plate, which allows me to have more freedom of movement and also get a more square placement and a more solid placement, because trying to clamp the ground clamp to either the vertical post or the base plate in this case was just very challenging. Another thing you need to keep in mind is that when you're using a pre-used rod, you always want to make sure that you have it heated up and melted down to where the gas powder coating starts, so that you don't just get it a lot of slag and a lot of stickiness, but you actually get the welding rod to be able to create a good solid weld from the first get-go. If you have clamps or magnets that you can use, such as what I'm using here, those are a really good idea, even though some of them aren't strong enough to hold it all by itself, especially considering this tube is almost 3 foot tall. It does give just enough support for it to kind of keep it on the measurements you place, and then you have to force it around, and it helps you from throwing everything way out of placement while you're welding or while you're trying to get it all squared up. Be cautious with your tacks. The one thing that I have a tendency to do is over tack. I sometimes act more like I'm going to finish weld it. I do that because sometimes I make a small tack and then it's not strong enough, and then the thing falls apart and I have to go back through the whole process of reapplying it. I would prefer to have too much weld on a tack than too little weld, but still remember that if you tack weld, when you go back to finish weld, you're going to have to fight with that tack weld, which means you're either going to have to grind it off and weld over it, or you're going to have to try to weld through it and make it mold to the rest of the weld. And both of those circumstances or situations can be complicated and can create a poor looking weld if you don't do them right. Tack welding also is relative to the use of the presented item or the mock-up. For instance, in this case, I decided to tack weld a little bit bigger tacks because I knew that this handrail would be in a temporary form for a little while, and it would be being moved and drug around and just generally being kind of used a little bit to kind of get an idea and experimented with. And if I had put really small tacks, I was afraid that the base plate might fall off or the spine might fall off, and then I would have to go back and retack it up. So I chose to give it more aggressive tack welds just to hold it in place for sure until I went back into the finish welding. In the case that I have here, I'm going back and checking my square on the base plate and on the vertical. It was good enough for what we were doing, and when I drill the holes through it and put the cement anchor bolts through it, then it'll flatten out a little bit more as well. And in this case, to try to make sure everything worked the way that I wanted it to, I went ahead and tacked on the base plate. And then I am going back now with a belt sander. You can use an angle grinder, but I have a belt sander at home, so I just chose to use it to get that angle for the handrail spine the perfect degree I wanted. And you'll see that I just run the belt sander across both edges of the tube at an angle to make sure that it creates that uniform angle on both sides and it's flat, so it'll be squared up on top. After I had finished sanding down the angle on the vertical post, it was time for me to weld the spine on. So what I did is, knowing that my spine was 120 centimeters long, I decided how many centimeters from the edge or the end of the spine at the top and at the bottom I wanted the post to be, and then I marked that off. As you can see, there's a line across the flat bar there that the clamp is mounted to. And when I put this post down, you'll also see that on this vertical post here, there is a arrow that points down toward the flat stock, and that was to make sure that I remembered what side went to what area. And I did that arrow before I even welded the flat stock on the bottom as the base plate. It's not a bad idea, because sometimes in a rush you don't notice the minimal angle that you've cut, and you can tack things up incorrectly. Now here, due to the fact that this is an angle and the angle is tighter on the side closest to the ground clamp, it was going to be harder to weld that. So my first tack that I'm going to put is going to be on the outside, because that's the easier side to get to, and then I'll go back and tack on the inside once I don't have to hold it with my hand anymore. Another thing that's good to keep in mind is that even though the flat bar said that it was 2 inches wide, as we talked about in the original video, it wasn't exactly 2 inches wide, which means that this tube, even though it's not exactly 2 inches wide, actually sticks out a little bit past the side of the flat bar. So with that in mind, you have to have a good eye and just try to center it up the best you can, and then you can tack it into place and it won't create any problems in the future. Having any kind of angle on tube such as we have here makes it difficult to hold and to weld, because even though it's flat bar and you have the top of the tube squared off, it still has a tendency to rock, because your surface of your stable surface is very, very small in comparison to the leverage that the tube has overall. For that same reason, I have the flat stock on the table and I have the tube sticking up, because if I had tried to place the tube on the table and weld the flat stock, holding that flat stock would have been really, really hard to make sure it held square to the tube end and I could actually weld it. So it was just easier to do it in the form that I have it here, and it's just a personal preference, but you can do it however you'd like to if you ever get in this kind of work. So after having repeated the same work on the other upright, here we have the handrail completed.
I hope you guys have really enjoyed everything that you've been seeing here at Beginners Fab, and I hope you guys continue to stop by to see what new stuff we have going on. You can check us out at our YouTube channel and also at our website at www.beginnersfab.blogspot.com, where we'll keep things updated each time that we have something new for you guys.